So, good afternoon, everyone. A very warm welcome to our Creature Research event. I am Wesley, Professor of Transcultural Arts and Design and Director of Creature. And joining me is Yaxet Louis Scarsel, Reader in Public Art and Performance, Deputy Director of Creature. It is our pleasure to welcome you all to today's book launch. Before we begin, please note that this session is being recorded. I think it's already started. To facilitate the recording, we asked you to switch off your camera and microphone during the talk. And the speakers are going to take questions towards the end of the session. We encourage you to post questions in the chat box, or you could also raise your hand for questions towards the end of the session. So for those who are joining us for the first time, Creature stands for the Research Center for Creative Arts, Cultures and Engagement. Our center brings together interdisciplinary research in the creative arts, cultures and societal engagement, focusing on its practice and cultural impact. We are proud to host a diverse range of disciplines, including cultural and creative industries, material and visual culture, practice-based and practice-led research, including areas such as curation, fashion textiles, filmmaking, material culture, photography, public art, and visual arts. We run a monthly program featuring research activities from both our members and external researchers. We invite you to explore our website, where you will find information about upcoming events, recent research projects from our members, and an archive of past events. You simply Google Creature London Met, you will find us on the first link. Today's event is to celebrate the launch of Darcy Lange, Videography as a Social Practice by our colleague Mercedes Vincent. Congratulations, Mercedes, for the release of the book. Mercedes is a curator, writer, and researcher. She is Associate Lecturer in Critical and Contextual Studies at the London Metropolitan University and Associate Lecturer at MA Culture, Criticism and Curation at Central St. Martin's. She has held museum positions at Interim Director of Education and Public Programs at Whitechapel Gallery in London, Curator of Contemporary Art and Darcy Lange Curator at Large at Govett Brewster Art Gallery, Lange Centre in New Zealand, and Research Curatorial Assistant at the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York, among others. Mercedes will be in conversation with Stephen Ball. Stephen is an artist and research fellow at Central St. Martin, where he manages the British Artist Film and Video Study Collection. His research encompasses historical and contemporary artists, moving image, post-expanded cinema practices, and the relationship to contemporary collections and archives. He writes on contemporary and historical moving image related art practice and occasionally curates screenings and exhibitions. As an artist, he has worked in audiovisual media since the early 1980s across a range of performance, screening, and exhibition contexts. He also writes, performs, and releases song recordings. His practice engages with local and global landscape ecologies, reflecting social, political, environmental, and post-colonial conditions, often situated within and between the UK and Australia. He's a member of the Sensing Sight Artists Collective. And thank you, Stephen, for joining us on this occasion.
You're welcome.
Without further ado, I now pass the floor to Mercedes to introduce the book and kickstart the event.
Thank you, Wesley and Jacek, for hosting us. It's a pleasure to be part of this event. And I'm really thankful to Stephen for agreeing to have a conversation. So I think it will run much easier as a conversation than me doing a presentation. And I met Stephen when I first came to London, and we've been in touch, and he's aware of Darcy Lange because back in the, actually before I arrived in London, I deposited some of Darcy Lange works at the video collection in Central St. Martin's through David Curtis. And when I arrived in London, we started a conversation about Darcy Lange. So he was perfect person to have a conversation with about the book. And he has taken quite an interest in Darcy Lange's work and read the book he's preparing a review as well of the book. So I thought it would be the right person to have a conversation with. So, Stephen?
Yes, thank you. I'm happy to have a conversation, and particularly, I mean, it's been very interesting to see the work that you've done around Darcy Lange's work, which has culminated in this book at this stage. Where it goes from here, we'll see. But the book is, I mean, it's a remarkable book, I think, in the sense that it really kind of situates Darcy Lange's practice, both kind of historically in the time that he was working. So we're talking about the sort of the late 60s into and through the 1970s, and situates him alongside other moving image artists who were working around that time, but also a lot of the concerns that were around in arts and in art and culture, and generally to do with what you describe as social practice. So I think your book really does. I was trying to find the kind of the right word to describe it, and I came up with, and this is a sort of term that you hear around, but it does a real kind of deep dive into Lange's work. And it's incredibly well researched. It's very thorough, and it comes up with some really kind of intriguing and enticing kind of suggestions about how to situate his work. Because I was aware of his work really from the early days when I started working in the British Artist Film and Video Study Collection, because there's a certain amount of his work was represented there. But then now there is a lot more. So partly, or mostly, because you've managed to donate some of his work to us, Mercedes. So one thing that I would flag up is that if people are interested in seeing his work, then they can make an appointment to come in to the study collection to view it. So I'll give details of how to do that a bit later. But the other thing about the book is that he's an artist who is not terribly well known, even within artist moving image circles. His work hasn't really been given the kind of attention that other artists' work have. And I think partly what might come out of our conversation will reveal some of the kind of reasons for that, because in terms of the way he doesn't sit easily in the canon, in a sense, in the way that a lot of that work is described. So I think that's probably something that will probably become more clearer, how that came about and what the context was as we talk about it. It will be revealed. We're going to attempt to show some, if the technology works for us, we're going to attempt to show some short extracts from some of his videos towards the end of the talk. And I'm sort of probably working on the assumption that a lot of people here, for the reasons that I've just mentioned, are not terribly familiar with his work, maybe haven't seen it at all. So I'm hoping that the conversation will whet your appetite to see more, and there will be, an opportunity to see short extracts from it towards the end. But yeah, we'll get into kind of more. We'll probably touch on things like the durational aspects of his work, because that is a significant factor of the way he worked and his process as we go along. But it's really just a way of saying that the short extracts that you'll see at the end are really only very, very fleeting sort of examples. So having said all that, I think I've got a few kind of questions that we'll use as prompts for a conversation. But I think I'd start off with Mercedes asking if you could give us a bit of an introduction of about who Darcy Lange was and what instigated your interest in his work.
Okay. Well, some of you might have heard me speak about Darcy Lange. I hope that there's enough people in the audience that never have heard me speak about Darcy Lange, so I'm not repeating myself. But basically, for those who do not know at all Darcy Lange was a New Zealand artist who came to London in the 1960s, at the end in 68, to study at the Royal College of Art. And he came as a sculptor. His practice was, he did quite large abstract geometric sculptures in the form of Anthony Caro and David Smith. And as he went on in his studies at the Royal College of Art, he became more and more interested, less interested in sculpture and more in issues of realism, the class system in the UK, and especially the working class. So by the time that he finished his studies, he moves from abstract geometric sculptures towards more figurative work. And by the end of it, starts using switches. By the time that he finished at the Royal College, he switches to lens media. He starts adopting photography, film, and video, primarily at the beginning, until he settles in video and works only on video by the mid-70s. During that period, Darcy Lange was producing recordings of people at work. So all the early works in moving image are around documentations of people working in industrial settings, in rural settings. It has a series called Cantavieja, which we'll try to show a little clip at the end. That it was a study that he did in Spain, in Castellón, one of the regions that have been affected by the floods near Valencia, is the only work that he produced in Spain. But mainly he was going outside London in the northern regions of the UK, recording miners and recording people in factories. And then eventually moves into a practice in the 70s, following again the interest in recording people at work. And he does a series of works where the practice kind of changes dramatically. And he records people in the classroom, teachers in the classroom. And his practice changes in the sense that he's starting to question the function of these recordings. So he moves from trying to create somehow an archive of images of the working class to questioning the politics of representation in the school's projects. And by 1976, 77, he started producing a series of works in the classrooms. We'll discuss this, where the intention of the work changes dramatically. Is the idea of how can we use the camera to intervene in a situation and transform and be transformative. So the camera is a tool to enter in a situation that can potentially intervene and produce change rather than simply create an image. And you start questioning the authorship, you start questioning what are the images for ultimately. There's a number of issues that come around that time. And eventually that work starts, eventually Darcy Lange starts questioning more and more the politics of representation, the intentions in using video. And there is a moment where he returns to New Zealand and starts creating a work called the Maryland Project, where he gets where the work starts moving more towards militant cinema, and joins the struggles of at a time in New Zealand where Maori, called the Maori Renaissance, where there is a moment of protest, and joins other Maori collaborators to try to join those efforts for Maori sovereignty. And so the work started taking a very different direction from the early on. So that's kind of a little bit of an introduction of his work.
Excuse me.
Yeah, and he eventually, he most of the time he was in Europe during the 70s and early 80s. But at one point he moves back to New Zealand in '83. And I think that he sort of fell out of the scene and his work became, you know, sort of, forgotten.
So that's you've sort of answered the first part of my question there. But the second part is really about your interest in him, because as we know, you have done quite a long engagement with his work since, for what would it be? We're talking about 20 years or
almost
so.
20 years. Yeah.
So what really instigated that? Where did that come from?
Well, I was living in New York and for many years, and then I moved to New Zealand to become a curator of contemporary art at the Governor Brewster Art Gallery. And Benjamin Buchloh, an art historian at Harvard at the time, had met Darcy Lange in the 70s through the Nova Scotia School of Art and Design. He was at the time the editor of publications, and the Nova Scotia School of Art and Design was an important place because Dan Graham was there, and he was a figure that invited a lot of video artists from New York and invited Darcy as well to give workshops and to talk and introduce video to the school. When Benjamin Buchloh learned that I was moving to New Zealand, he suggested me to look into the work of Darcy Lange. And my intention when I arrived there in 2005 was to actually contact the artists and see what the work was like. They had lost contact over the years. But Darcy died right after a few weeks, in fact, a month after I arrived, and I never got to meet him. But I realized that nobody was, representing his work, and he did not get the recognition, perhaps, or when he arrived. So the idea was that his archive and all the work could disappear. So I sort of initiated, because he was linked to the museum. The museum had acquired one of the early works, the sculptures, and acquired a few videos, and he was part of that region. I felt that the Governor Brewster could be the right institution to take that initiative. And I contacted the family, and basically that was the beginning of almost 20 years of research. But basically what it came out is that we work with the New Zealand Film Archive. We deposit all the video work and film work there, so then it would be preserved, because it was the right place to be, we thought at the time, for preservation. The first thing was to preserve the work, and second, I said I would take any film that they had, and I started the archive, which is now deposited at the Governor Brewster Art Gallery, of all his personal, documents and books and everything else that was not video and film. We also have the negatives there of all the photography, and then through the archive, I also I did a retrospective that traveled nationally. Then I started to contact the people that would have known him in the 70s and tried to bring him back into the scene. We did a show at Icon Gallery in 2008. And then I was putting together a book. It was an anthology of writings of a number of scholars like Benjamin Buchloh and Dan Graham and Guy Brett and others. And that got published. I wanted to find a publisher outside New Zealand, so then the book will have a dissemination, and I can agree to co-publish. So that kind of gave the work a little bit of more visibility, brought it back to Europe. And there were subsequently, also because of the schools projects, it was at the time of the educational turn, where everybody was looking at artists working with pedagogy and educational issues. So the work picked up, and there were a number of exhibitions. And then I came to London to do my PhD. So somehow it has rolled over the years. I never thought that my engagement with Darcy Lange will continue for so long. But yeah, the book is sort of the work of all these years, and coming to the Royal College to do my PhD was a great opportunity to give the work a real research opportunity, because when you're working for museums, you're producing exhibitions, you're producing lots of things. I mean, and I was not only just working on Darcy Lange. So coming to the Royal College was the right place.
Because he was a student at the Royal College, wasn't he?
Yeah, because he came to the Royal College, and at the time Uta Metabauer was there, and she had come through New Zealand, and she got interested in his figure. And so I managed to bring the archive to London, and the Royal College was very nice to share a space for me to bring the archive. And I used the archive to reach out to curators at Tate and other main institutions here in the UK. And as a result of that, a number of exhibitions came out so he was sort of returning into the scene, which was really appropriate. Yeah. I mean, video, when Darcy was working in video, I mean, leaving the main media, sculpture and painting, was something that obviously through conceptual artists, I mean, there was a lot of conceptual artists that were abandoning traditional media and they were adopting new media. But of course, adopting the video scene in the early 1970s was very, very small. Me having studied in America, my references were American, and I realized when I was doing my first year or so in London, I spent some time at the study collection going through all the video artists of that era. And I realized that I didn't know anybody because there was aside from perhaps the main names, but the scenes were quite separate. I mean, there was the New York scene around radical software and all the video artists of that in New York, but because also the media were use different systems, the NTSC as opposed to the PAL, it really precluded from videos being exchanged across the Atlantic at the beginning until. And in institutions like MoMA, for instance, were unable to. I mean, he was part of a video show in 1975, and also at the Kitchen, but the clunkiness of the technology at that time really prevented from video traveling so easily and being exhibited. And it was not until probably late 70s that institutions had the right equipment to be able to transfer tapes to the different formats. So, and not even photography was considered a medium that people would be collecting. So if you were adopting video as your main media, you were going to be part of very small scene that were mainly shown in alternative spaces. It was not collected, it was not exhibited. You were already part of a very sort of grassroots anti-system, anti-market, anti-everything. And I think that in the 90s, when there were a lot of revisions of the history of video, when videos are starting to be starting to enter a museum and it's starting to get collected, and the history of videos is starting to be written, Darcy wasn't around anymore, and the videos were not available. So there's a lot of figures that somehow have fallen out of those histories because because of the nature of the medium at that time.
And I think that it's probably the case that his use of I mean, I was going to say moving image, but he also worked a lot with still photography as well. So he would combine he would combine 16mm film, video, and still photographs within the same pieces of work, which was quite sort of unusual because particularly within the film and video scene, the film and video practices in the sort of late 60s to early 70s, and certainly video became developed as a practice more in the 1970s. They were quite separate from each other for a start. There was very much there was very much a distinction between the media, and they had somewhat different kind of concerns as well. So certainly in the sort
Absolutely.
of 60s
Yeah.
and 70s, experimental film in this country was very much concerned with the form and material of the film. And
Right.
video was also concerned with sort of what we might think of as kind of formal questions, but of course being considered to be a different medium, and also with its kind of relationship to mainstream broadcast television, it had a whole different set of concerns even to film. And Darcy Lange had another set of concerns altogether, so he didn't really kind
Altogether.
of fit
Yeah.
naturally in
Right.
any of those kind of contexts, I guess.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this is. I mean, when I wrote the book, and maybe we could talk about how the book is constructed.
Yeah.
When I wrote the book, I was almost tempted in my dissertation. I mean, I'll talk a little bit about the book. So the book, which is my doctoral research, the book moves chronologically from the beginning, from his sculptural work until basically I end up in the 1980s with. Actually, he did a number of performative works that he called multimedia operas, and that include music. And I won't go into that, but anyway, in the middle of the 80s. And when I was going to publish the book now, as it is, I was tempted to drop my first chapter where I talked about. I mean, at the beginning, I was really questioning how his practice comes out and transfers from being a sculpture, what triggers and what allows, what was happening in the scene for an artist who works in a sculpture to adopt lens medium. And of course, I felt tempted to just drop that first chapter and just go straight into the lens media and the video practice. But I think that in a way is important. It's an important chapter because again, it just shows that Darcy's is not coming from the film tradition. It's coming from the visual arts tradition and from the concerns that were happening at that time. He's moving away. There were many others who abandoned the traditional media of painting and sculpture, and it's conceptual art, which engages with the dematerialization of the artwork. There are considerations about what art is. There's ideas of art and society. All of those things were happening at that time. But also, I think that in certain ways, his interest in the working class, in recording the working class, in realism, somehow would have been seen as regressive at that time. So I kind of start with the book trying to say how can actually to anchor the artist as a visual artist, just to indicate that he's coming from that tradition. So some of the aesthetics choices also are going to be informed by visual arts and the debates that would have taken place at that time within that context. I think that today, when we talked about contemporary art, is so wide and so expanded. It's in the expanded field. There's no fields anymore. But at that time, the disciplines were much more clearly defined. I mean, Rosalind Krauss talks about post-medium. There's all these things that somehow, and you can understand how maybe he would have moved. But adopting a realistic, adopting a concern and an interest in realism, it would have been seen as kind of regressive, even in when he moves from the abstract geometric abstraction, the abstract geometric sculptures to adopting realism. That would have been very regressive. And what I try to sort of indicate is that there is from the very beginning an interest in a practice that is much more political without being, what's the word, doctrinaire or directly political. But yeah, so then the book moves from that. Then the second chapter continues looking at the work studies, but from introducing film theory, looking at, because his work is about observation, there's the idea of duration, no editing, no narrative, which if you would have come from the film tradition, maybe those elements would have been much more pertinent. But in the case of Darcy, he's not engaging with any of that. And so I introduced the film theory in the second part of in the second chapter. But looking at ethnographic film, looking at what they call, Noel Birch talks about primitive cinema, all these sort of practices that are not commercial cinema, as a way to frame the kind of image making that he's doing with moving image.
One thing that just kind of slightly before that point, and I was just thinking about this in terms of so that you write about him being interested in the notion of social realism, which of course had other connotations, but also at that time, I mean, I was kind of thinking, and I can't remember whether I'm just looking at some notes I made. I can't remember whether I made this note or whether it came from your book, but I was thinking about how in particular filmmaking practice at that time saw itself as there was a kind of split in a sort of Marxist influence, really, and the way that in some cases the avant-garde became very much aware of sort of historical materialism and representation, and moved away from a kind of social context. Whereas I get the sense, or very clear sense, that Darcy Lange practice was rooted in concerns about the social context, and he talked about social realism. And one of his early, I guess, sort of post kind of conceptual sculptures, maybe you could call it, was the Irish road workers sculpture, which to me seemed to kind of prefigure his interest in the observation of people at work, which became his sort of interest in his film and video work. So what you do in the book is to make these kind of fairly clear connections in the development of his concerns away from sculpture, but still with the same kind of social realism, and as you say, the work and lives of working class people in particular, people working in factories and schools and so on. So so I mean, I think that there's you trace a really kind of interesting thread through all of those works.
I mean, the third chapter is where I introduce continuing. So the book progresses chronologically, but then there's these transversal chapters where, and so the third chapter is about photography theory, but I'm looking for the histories of photography and the artists, actually the 70s, in a number of artists who were writing, trying to reclaim the social documentary in photography, like Alan Sekula, with the early writings of photography, and looking at the workers' photography in the 1920s and 30s, just sort of reclaiming those histories that in modernism have been sort of totally, ignored, and going back to those histories of social photography with a critical position, so then that would question again, those representations, but again, reclaiming those histories that have been. So I try to sort of, bring that context again to the kind of work that Darcy was making. And he, even though he was not writing, I mean, I was thinking of Joyce Pence in the UK and Terry Dennett, and the kinds of writings that they were publishing, like In Camera Work, which was one of the magazines that they were doing at that time, and that kind of context. But then again, as we move towards the schools project, I think that the idea of creating an image is not enough. So there's the idea of not just creating an archive, but how could we activate the image, and who is the image for, and who has the right to speak for themselves. So the camera is not just a camera that records an image, and it's not an issue about being truthful to the image, but how can the camera can intervene in a social situation, and perhaps create, be a catalyst for a different dynamic, and that's when Darcy's stopped just making recordings of the teachers, but started showing the recordings to the teachers and the students as a way for self-assessment, not just how they perform when teaching or learning in the classroom, but also what does that image do to them? How can be the beginning or trigger a conversation, and a different dynamic between the teachers and the students that might be transformative. So he's not longer making an image, but he's questioning, what that image can do.
Yeah. I mean, that's another kind of very clear thread through his work. Is this and that develops as his work changes, is a concern not so much with what the artwork is, but what the artwork does, really, what it can achieve, and what he can do with it within the given situations that he puts himself in. So that's kind of really clear with and then it goes on to the later work as well. I mean, one aspect of this as well, which is we've got a question, I think. We'll get to that in a second. I mean, one aspect as well in terms of the kind of the formal qualities of the work is the use of the long duration tape, which is something that is in various different contexts is a kind of formal device that is used in experimental cinema in various ways. But I think he used it in a very particular way, particularly in relation to his observations of working situations and factors and so on. So and that kind of comes out of you write about that in that chapter where you're talking about the kind of formal qualities of other experimental practices. I mean, I'm thinking of particularly people like Warhol, and that's those sort of parallels, but to a completely different kind of ends, which is much more to do with his ideas of the work of art as work in itself, and as working as a kind of parallel to the workers in the factory and so on.
Well, I think that with duration, what happens is when you keep the camera for a long time on the worker, you get to see their singularities. I think that he's very intentional. He's very interested in showcasing, what work looks like. He's interested in highlighting the potential alienation that might come from, people repeating their text one and again and again and again. The skillfulness that perhaps certain jobs might have. There are studies that are in factories where somebody might be repeating the same gesture over and over, over 8 hours. And of course, his recordings are not 8 hours, but they trying to, sort of, sometimes I said there's an element of empathy, but also an element of trying to perhaps highlight their singularities. And we see that sometimes with the studies where we have two workers doing the same task, but then we see how even in tasks that might be quite repetitive, there's an element of creativity potentially, or a way of doing things that might show one worker being more skillful than other. And it's not just to highlight or compare them, but it's just to sort of to show the intrinsicies of work.
Yes, yes.
And how work takes time, and so I think duration is a very important element in his practice. And I think you're referring probably to a work called A Documentation of Bradford Working Life, which is one of the early works that were quite systematically structured. That work, he went around 5 factories in Bradford, and which he calls situations. And then for each factory, he picks up a number of workers, and then so it does 3 to 5 studies for each. And so he follows a specific worker and puts the camera on, and there's no editing; it's just raw material. And sometimes he zooms in a little bit just to see the maybe the use of their hands, or just to see sort of more detail. But yeah, it's the idea of how each work is singular, is different, and how do they perform the work day by day. So
yeah, and his main imperative was to represent that, to represent their work, and give and the duration gives a kind of some sense of the time spent working, I guess, in that sense.
Right.
There's a question from Joseph in the chat already.
Sure.
Which I don't know if you can see it, but he's asking what sort of answers, conclusions, observations arose from using the camera as a tool for intervention in that way.
Well, we can. I'm gonna, if technology allows, if we don't get. I mean, I have chosen a couple of clips, and again, I mean, there is an intention for. There's a lot of things. I mean, the school studies are fascinating, and the more and more that you look at them, I mean, his intention, the way that they were structured, just to explain, is especially the Oxfordshire study in 1977, which was commissioned by the Museum of Modern Art, Oxford. In that study is very structured. So he wanted to show the idea of class. So he selected 4 schools, 2 were private and 2 were public. Then he also focused on 3 subjects: art, science, and history. And so for each school, he would choose a science teacher, an art. And then he also introduces this element of recording the classroom and then showing the classroom study to the students and the teacher. And he records the teacher's reaction to that recording, and then the student's reaction to that recording. It is interesting because when you see the conversations, the conversations go both ways. The students not only talked about how they saw themselves, but they also talked about how the teacher, how well he did or not. So that situation creates an opportunity for assessing or discussing what happens in the classroom. And it's interesting because, I mean, of course, today we are all so used to see ourselves, recorded. Our engagement with media is so different. But this is the 70s, where most of the people didn't even own a camera and might not been taking pictures of themselves. So the idea that the children could see themselves. I mean, also that the technology allowed at that time that after the recording, you could play back that recording to the people, and people could just see immediately what was recorded. And that has great potential, is what that image can do to you, to your sense of yourself, your confidence, how well you have performed or not. But also that was sort of by that recording allowed to a conversation, a discussion that would not have taken place if it wasn't for that intervention.
Yes, and I think that's sort of, we've got a second question here. I don't know if you can see that, where Renate has asked a question about how does this set up? I mean, I at the end asked how was his approach anthropological in a traditional sense, and I think your description of his process it answers that really in the sense that it's certainly not anthropological in a traditional sense where you know, we expect the anthropologist or the ethnographer or who is it to be separate from their subject, whereas actually he engaged the subject in this kind of conversation, which he considered to have the potential to be socially transformative, as you described, through the use of what was then a very new medium. You know, people, as you say, weren't used to the idea of shooting video of themselves or anything else. It was something that was the preserve of, you know, broadcast television. So this would have been quite a kind of radical experience for them, in a sense, to see themselves and to recognize that.
And one of the clips, you know, one of the teachers who was quite articulate, and he talks about, you know, he says, I'm really interested to what could come out for, you know, for the students to see themselves represented. The students were not only seeing the tapes that they were the recordings of themselves, but then when the exhibition, when the work was exhibited at the Museum of Modern Art, Oxford, they also had access to recordings of other students. So they also could compare themselves to how other students were learning in other contexts, you know, how schools look like in more privileged schools, or, you know, or how different was. So there's a lot of things that could potentially lead to lots of conversations. Of course, it is impossible to measure, you know, whether that, you know, the impact of those tapes, because nobody came back later on to, you know, there's no continuation, no way to prove that. I mean, it is all sort of in potentiality, but certainly, and I think that Mr. Perks does talked about the fact that it brings a self-reflexivity to the children that would not have that did not existed before. And that it was a platform for bringing questions that, and he talks about how that criticality might have an impact in the future when they go into the world. And I mean, again, it's very utopic. You can't prove that. It's not so scientific. There's also lots of questions. What I also like is in the conversation is not just Darcy asking the questions to the teachers. The teachers are asking Darcy, what is it that you're doing? Is this art? How can you say that this is art? And there's all this sort of conversation that goes back and forth. And it's a time that is everything is done very intuitively. You know, there's not the terms to look at these works as socially engaged practice. I mean, it's funny, you know, in chapter 4, I talked about Claire Bishop and you know, the ideas of participatory art and socially engaged practices that has come out later on in the 90s, late 90s and 2000s. And of course, she traces back, you know, to certain practices in the 70s that could be proto works of what we call today socially engaged art, like, you know, the artist placement group, and you know, which Darcy somehow got involved as well. It's this idea of what art can do, and the intention that art does something else other than perform in the gallery or be for the gallery, but that can engage with the society and have a purpose. So
And I guess
how
that's demonstrated
successful
by,
that is
sorry,
difficult. Yeah.
yeah, and I guess that's demonstrated by the fact that his work was always placed within an art context. It was always exhibited and so on. He didn't. There was no kind of disciplinary crossover between it as an art practice and what we might think of as anthropology or sociology or whatever. Even though his practices did contain elements of those sort of inquiries, it still remained very much within the milieu of art. In that sense.
Yeah, and for him that was a frustration. I mean, this is I struggle with changing the title of the book, and some good friends who I think they're in the chat at the moment know of my struggle with the title. But at the end, I wanted to choose videography rather than video art, and I tried to make a case for that, because I think those early practices are practices that did have that sort of political intention, that what later became video art. And this is one of the arguments that, when video starts to become part of the gallery and being collected and historicized and all those things. But these early practices were much more politicized, much more grassroots. There was a lot of exchange between artists and other people that were using video as community workers. There was a lot of exchange of ideas, and I think that it was really a rejection of the art market. But Darcy was frustrated, in certain ways. There's this ambivalence of, you don't want to call your work art, but at the same time you reclaim the work as art, because that's your platform, that's your milieu, this is where you work. You're not a social worker, you're an artist. But with this intention that the work could do something else, and that perhaps, those studies, one of the claims that I make for the book is that I don't think, even though the work was commissioned by the Museum of Modern Art Oxford and it was shown there, ultimately, I would say that the work exists in that interaction with the students, and not necessarily is the intention or the ultimate place for the work is the art gallery. I mean, he at the time already expressed that frustration, but he didn't know where else to place it.
Yes.
So there's an ambivalent relationship with the art gallery, and the recognition that the work really is not for the art gallery. The work, and I think that the work exists. The work functions as a situation, as an intervention in the social milieu. In reality.
I was just looking at the time because I wondered whether now is a good time to try and see if we can get our technology to work and to show some of the clips.
Okay,
yes.
we're gonna try it. Okay, so I'm gonna share my screen and I'm gonna play it from my desktop. And the first clips that I'm gonna show, I'm gonna show just, as I said, Darcy was working in long, in durational format. So the works were not edited, and the studies sometimes will go for 10 or 15 minutes or 8 minutes. And of course, we don't have the time for that. So I'm just gonna give you clips of works. I'm bastardizing the work because it's supposed to be shown as it is in real time. But just to give you a flavor, I'm just gonna show maybe 1 minute of 3 studies. The one is from a Bradford Working Life, a documentation of Bradford Working Life from 1974. And again, be aware that this work was video, film, and photography. But I'm just showing a clip from the video component. And there are 2 situations. So there's one is about woolen meals, and it's a person using the spinning system. There's also a packer from a warehouse where they will just pack materials for mailing packages, and there's 2 studies there, and then there's one more study of Cantavieja, which is the rural study in Spain, and these were a series of studies that he followed a family and all the rural work that they were doing there, and he spent a couple of weeks with them, following them around and recording their work there. Then we'll have a little, stop, maybe commented on that, and then I'll show you a series of clips from the schools project from the Birmingham studies. So I'm going to try to see if this works. Hopefully it will.
Yeah, unfortunately, we're not getting the sound for this, are we? Cheers.
Sorry. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
What was the issue?
There was no sound. I don't know.
Oh,
if
I'm so
anybody else
sorry.
could
I think I didn't activate the sound. Sorry. I'll do it again.
Okay.
But you could see the image, no?
See the images, yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So actually, it was quite loud for me, so I was trying to bring it down. Okay, I'll do it again. Very sorry. Hi.
Yeah, so I think
Sorry.
I mean, I think it's important to see those
on a
because
second.
it gives a real sense of what the work looked like. I mean, that has a very particular aesthetic quality, which is due to the video technology of the time. I presume he used half-inch reel-to-reel Portapak tape and so on, and it has that sort of low contrast, very grey kind of quality. But those particular works would have been the video would have been shown alongside film and still photographs originally.
The first 3 clips in the factories, which is part of a documentation of her work in life, there were 15 studies altogether. So 15 studies altogether from 5 factories, and those were for each. He called each factory a situation, and then he devises, he selects 3 to 5 workers within each, and then what he does is he uses around 15 minutes of video for the studies, and then he has 1 minute of film, and then he has 1 photograph per person per study. So when they were shown at the kitchen in 1976, and also at the Bradford Industrial Museum that commissioned the work, they were shown with the 3 components. So you would have photographs around the room, and then you would have video in a monitor, and then film would be projected. And so it created sort of an immersive environment where you have the sounds coming from the film and the video, as well as and then you have the photographs. So it's interesting because the photographs are very much portraits, frontal portraits of the workers. The workers are posing in front of their workplace. And then you see the work, obviously, but he was very much interested in comparing what does photography do when it comes to show work, what film can do to the image. So it's about image making. But that formality sort of gets abandoned by the time that he finished this work. And in Cantabieja, the one with the rural setting, he has photographs, but it was mainly video. But he was always shooting photographs, always, whether the thing is that there are certain works that they were never shown, or so we don't know what sort of format they would have taken in a gallery context, how they would have been displayed. But in the case of a documentation of Bradford working life, we do have documents at the kitchen and Bradford working life at the Bradford Museum, Industrial Museum, where there are images of how things were installed. But if the work was not shown, or if the venues could only show video, then Darcy would not be able to show the works as he planned them to be.
Yes.
Yeah. So because we're running out of time, I just would like you to play a couple of clips from the schools, because I think it's quite interesting, and especially the conversation with Mr. Perks, because he talks about this potential that he sees in the work. I'm going to share this again.
Talk about any the films.
Yeah, obviously what interests me is the children's reaction to what you're doing. They are excited by it. They talk about it. They've talked a lot about it since you left yesterday, and they've popped in to have a word with me about it again this morning. Now, whether this is the feeling that they may one day, if your fortunes be resolved, appear themselves on television, but it's the fact that they've seen themselves on television. There's a chance for personal assessment. They've perhaps revalued themselves and their personalities a little bit by seeing themselves on television. But there is some magic about what has happened to them. As I say, whether it's the self-appraisal part of it, whether it's the fact that they've had a chance to talk about something, whether they've had a sort of rubbed shoulders with fame for a second or two. But there are tremendous possibilities for this. It's a field which is being explored in schools anyway, with videotaping and so on now. But this interests me greatly, the fact that the children themselves are so excited about it, and that what you do here goes over into other situations. I particularly like your idea of following up in the family. I think
I'd like to do that.
the deeper that you go in, the more penetrative a study that you'll produce. And I certainly think that going into people's hands, it would give that added dimension. Because we're all images, aren't we? However hard I'm trying now to be myself, I'm not quite being myself, And whereas with my family I tend to relax and spread out a little bit. But then I suppose you could have the situation with my children, seeing you for the first time wouldn't be perfectly natural. And wherever you go, you're turning over another leaf, aren't you? Or you're digging further down at the moment. I think the further you dig down, the nearer the truth that you'll get. What did also interested me was their comments on communication, which this is all part of, where they said that in our type of school, terrific actually what they said that the other school we saw there, even though they're supposedly more intelligent and so on, never asked the questions how or why. And they said that we did ask those questions in this school. We wanted to know why. We did discuss things. We found out reasons. And what delighted me was the way they said that they could then carry this on into the big world, into society. That the communication ideas which they developed in this school, they would take into society with them. And they also said they probably might even help to change society themselves. You see, so your media is possibly bringing their thoughts together, and from there they're going to go into the world, influence people. They're going to be the media themselves. They are individual media for impressing people. Well, they may never have asked themselves the questions if you hadn't come along and crystallized their thoughts.
The further you walk, the heavier it would get, because you were starting to get tired. So it was very difficult to carry things. It was very difficult to take things from one place to another, because there were no wheels. As I said, you couldn't catch a bus. You couldn't have a lorry to take those things. Now, many thousands of years ago, people who were called, or we think of them as the ancient Egyptians. Who can tell me what they are famous for? These people called the ancient Egyptians. They are famous for something. Derek? Pyramids. Building pyramids. Because although they were built thousands of years ago, they are still standing now. And I'm sure you cannot. And one of the things that we mentioned, or I mentioned, when I said, what have all these things got? And here you can see an old clock, or part of the inside of an old clock. Now, there, inside are all what for? Wheels. Although they're not round, or they are round, but they are not nice and smooth on the outside, as if I got a 10-penny piece, all nice and smooth. This would roll along nice and smooth. If I got this and rolled it along, it wouldn't roll so smooth, because there are bits missing. So although these are wheels, you mustn't just think of wheels as wheels on a car, wheels on a bicycle.
The evidence of his writings. He is a totally sort of mystery figure, biographically. There's no biography of Webster to be written, because there's no material. Most of his writings are just the plays, you see. There's a little poetry outside dramatic works, and there are the short lives. But they again represent really, they're a distillation of, of the sort of views of the smarty boys, really, I think, the last. So you've only got really the plays to go on, and it's very difficult to say. I think, you see, that prejudices of this kind, or views of this kind, can exist at a wide variety of intellectual levels. I mean, the notion about the thick Irish, just to take that for a minute, that can exist at the crudest possible.
Yes, so it's, and Joseph has made a point of the kind of almost uncanny way in which this sort of anticipates social media, perhaps. That's an interesting point. I'm wondering whether now would be a good point, because I think we've got about 10 minutes left. Perhaps we should open up to see if there are any questions or comments. There's one already. Xavier has asked what Darcy Lange's legacy is, and whether he's been an influence on artists, younger artists in New Zealand. I don't know. Do you what would be the answer to that?
I'm not sure that, I mean, there's a number of people that have been interested in his work, but he still remains a kind of isolated figure. And obviously those who are interested in documentary practices or realism, the notion of work, pedagogy, I mean, they would be looking at his work. But yeah, it still remains quite an isolated figure, and yeah, I'm still not sure what would be his legacy in New Zealand or somewhere else.
So maybe hopefully there's distribution of your book in New Zealand, and that might help to address that question, perhaps. I guess we could ask if should we ask if there's any other questions or comments? Oh, here we go. Connections between Lange and Stephen Willets. I believe there was some connection at some point.
Yeah, they certainly knew each other, and there's also, I mean, in sort of, yeah, I mean, it is not something that I explored in the book as much. I think I do mention him. I thought it was a stronger connection between them early on, but no, it's not. I mean, I think that Willits comes from a more sociological kind of position. So I don't draw as much. I don't bring him as a figure as close to Darcy as I thought he would initially. But yes, I mean, there is certainly connections between them.
And I guess, I mean, the other thing that's mentioned there is the Raven Row People Make Television show, which, from memory, was much more about the community unit set up to make work specifically for broadcast television.
Right.
But also parallel to that, there was the community video workshops that were around at the time, like Albany Video, which I understand.
Yeah.
Lange had some kind of connection with, and of course Fantasy Factory and the work.
Right, he also had connection with us, but you know, sometimes, yeah, I mean, and if you look at, you know, the video show that the famous video show that was in 1975 at Serpentine, I mean, that inclusivity where you find video artists that then became well known, like, you know, Carol Sheeman, I think, is in that show, and Mary Kelly and Dan Graham, to get alongside to community videos, community workers. You know, there's a lot of people. There were a lot of people that were starting to use the video as a vehicle or was a tool to engage, to portray the reality of you know, I think it was brought up in educational context, in you know, political context. So there was a lot of exchanges, but I again, somebody asked me once whether I would, you know, define Darcy Lange as a community video artist, and I don't think he was working in that capacity. I think again, you could see that there would be a lot in common between them because of his interest in working with real people and all that, but didn't come from that kind of. I think he worked very much as an isolated person with his communities, but not as part of a community work with specific politics or whatever. Yeah.
Yes, we've got about 5 minutes. If anybody has anything else,
burning question.
Renate said it was lovely to see the film, so it was worth
Yeah.
persisting with the technology, I think.
Yeah, but I have to say again, I mean, we did the, even when we presented the work at Tate a few years ago, and we had to do, programs for an hour and a half. It's still, I'm sampling Darcy Lange's work. I'm not presenting the work the way it should be with their own time, and it's very difficult. So this is only, me giving you little clips of the work. But if you are interested, I mean, I really highly recommend you to visit the study collection.
Yes.
The videos are there, and there's information if you're interested. I think there are copies of the book as well as the one in Icon Gallery that produced by, published by Icon Gallery. So if you're interested in the work, I'm always happy to discuss it with anybody. But also if you want to see the work, give yourself time, because it's all real time. So it requires a lot of time to see it. But if you really are interested, get in contact with Stephen and visit the study collection at Central St. Martin's.
Yeah, I'm just putting the details in the chat. We've got such a long name. I've never been able to acronize it. Artists, film and videos.
Oh, well, I'm very glad, because I never remember the whole title of the study collection. I just refer to it as that.
Yeah, Central St. Martin's. I'll put that there so that if anybody is interested in coming to see or do any research of about anything really, but particularly Darcy Lange's work, we have quite a large amount of his work now, courtesy of Mercedes, that they're copies of the work that are in the archive. A lot of what we have. We also have paper documentation and.
It's courtesy of the state. I was the one bringing the tapes, but they were not my tapes. They are the Darcy Lange state and the governors who allowed this.
So there's the details there in the chat. If you send me an email if you want to come and see something, I'm only part-time there, so it often may take a few weeks to get an appointment set up. But you're more than welcome to come in.
Can I just jump in, Stephen and Mercedes, just to say what an inspiring talk this has been, and it's really interesting because it does really bring to life this important body of work, which I only came across more recently, and there is something really special I find it because, and I think other people have commented about this idea of how it's both beautiful, almost hypnotic, but also very thought-provoking and particularly as you absorb more and more the work, you really start to get that important the social layers that are in the works, and it's so thank you very much for bringing it to all of our attentions. And the book is I'm sure we've ordered copies for our own library here in London Met. Perfect, because I mean this is I teach on the MA Public Art and Performative Practices here in London Met, and of course this is the type of work that is absolutely so vital. So we will absolutely make sure that the book becomes one of our reading list cores. Thank you both.
Good. Excellent.
Thank you so much for hosting us.
Thank you very much, Mercedes and Stephen. Yes, thank you so much, both of you. That was an excellent session, and we were so blessed that there is no technological hiccup, so all of us could see the wonderful documentaries and the videos from the great artists. And thank you so much for these documentation, and the book is really great resources for a great artist. And I kind of, well, obviously, that's only 2 minutes. I'm not going to launch a question, but I just have a small comment to make that viewing the video really reminds me, kind of resonant with contemporary Chinese artist Jiao Fei, taking videos on in factories, especially like factories and
Yeah,
all
yeah,
this,
yeah.
demonstrating these sort of tremendous urbanizations and the country's evolutions from the kind of a sort of a closed trade regime to somewhere which transformed into a world factory. So that reminds me of that. It was absolutely wonderful, but it's actually in different time and different contexts. So that's very grateful for you to show us these contexts for the artists. I'm just going to have a little kind of publicity before we wind up the session, and just to remind the audience that we are having our next session, which is an internal session. I know that there's a lot of colleagues actually here as well, so unfortunately this is not for external audience, but we had an internal event of a creature lab, and it is on magic and materialism by Dr. Sally Hetzenberg, and she is going to talk about popular visual and material culture of fortune telling between the world wars in Britain. So it's a very exciting seminars that we're going to hold at our Aldgate campus. So for those of our colleagues who join us today, then please sign up for our next session, which is on the 4th of December. It's also a Wednesday from 5:30 to 6:30. And for external audience, please watch out our events. That would be in the new year. So we have more external events coming up as well. And so do check out our website. Thank you very much for all of you joining us for this session, and especially Mercedes, and congratulations again for the release of the book. And thank you, Stephen, for joining us on this occasion. Thank you all for the audience joining us, and we will see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.